Hello. Hello, hello. Well, I can't hear you all, but I'm really thrilled to do this live webinar with you guys. So before we get started, I'd like to say that on YouTube there is a chat that you can use to talk to me. I'll be looking in a chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to post it right in the chat on YouTube. And that's that. So without further ado, let's get started. Hi, my name is Gert Hengeveld. I am an engineer with Chroma, and I'm here to talk to you about working with Storybook for app development. So this is me. Like I said, I'm Gert Hengeveld. I work with Chroma, and Chroma is a company based in the US, and we are a very small startup with only 7 people right now. And we work on 2 projects. First is Storybook. Storybook is our open source project. It started out actually as an open source project before the company existed, and has been doing very well ever since. Like it's like very popular right now, and we are just trying to be good shepherds for this project. We don't own it in that sense. We just work on it a lot, and we basically employ the top contributors of this open source project, and they basically work on the project full time. And I am an engineer with Chroma, and I work on Chromatic most of the time. So I do get to touch Storybook from time to time, but most of the time I work in Chromatic, and Chromatic is our commercial offering, which is basically a platform that extends Storybook and is intended for teams. So it allows you to work together as a team on your storybooks. It provides free Storybook hosting, and on top of that, various workflows to make UI development way easier than it would otherwise be. And we're really trying to get everyone on board, such as designers, product owners, QA engineers, so that you can collaborate with your entire team on building UIs. But we'll see what Chromatic is later. So first about Storybook. Storybook is an open source project, like I said, and it's a tool to build UI components in your browser without needing to spin up the app itself that you're working on. So the big benefit is there is that you are able to essentially build UI components in isolation. So you don't have the context of an entire app that like could be built in any stack with the routing and the data APIs and such that are all like living in the app. You don't want to deal with all that while you're building your stories and your components. So Storybook takes it out of your app and allows you it just gives you a clean workspace where you can develop these components. And the idea is that you use Storybook to catalog all the various states and variants of your components that might exist. So for example, you can have a button, and that button might have various styles, a primary style, secondary style, but it might also have various sizes and various states. So it might be like in a loading state or something because you clicked something, and you want to catalog all those states. Actually, that's where a lot of the power of Storybooks comes in, because in a typical app, while you're building, say, your loading state, it's very hard to actually build that loading state, because in your app you would be like clicking this button and and it would be connected to an API and would probably be really quick to resolve the data, right? So this loading indicator only shows up for a really short time. And like the thing is, you actually want to develop those states without having to bother with trying to trigger that state. For example, an error state, well, like the API could not be reached, for example, that's a state that you don't want to like mock your network connection to disallow this URL from being fetched, for example. It's way easier to just build it in Storybook, and you can build that particular state in isolation. The way this works is with mock data. So you pass in mock data into your component, and your component will just render with that data. And finally, you can use it as a tool to document your components and to build out your entire library of components. So if you have a fairly complex app, you will have dozens, maybe hundreds of components, maybe even thousands, and you probably are working on a fairly big team, or like in a company with multiple teams even, where other developers might be using your components in their work. So it would be great if they'd have some documentation to go along with it. So that's where one of the add-ons that comes with Storybook is add-on docs that allows you to really easily document your component. In fact, it does a lot of the work automatically for you. So let's take a quick look at the chat so far. I see a question. Hi guys, is it possible to use knobs add-on to change the value of two props passed into component just by changing one knob value? So this is a question specifically to the add-on knobs. And I think, is it possible to change the value of two props based on one? Well, that's based on the implementation of your component, I suppose. As far as I know, there is not a way to like control multiple props from one knob. But to be honest, I don't have too much experience with add-on knobs, because I think it's kind of lacking in ways, and it also goes against the add-on knobs. Is an add-on that allows you to like tweak the value of the component props at runtime in a UI of Storybook. So you can drag a slider to change an integer value, for example, or type some label into a text field, and you'll see the component live update with that. That's very nice to find edge cases, and we're actually going to be working on ways to extract those configurations that you made into a component. That's a good suggestion, and you can do it through a wrapper component indeed, and you could like use a decorator for it, I guess, so you don't have to change the story itself or the component itself to deal with it. So yeah. Anyway, continuing, this is all there is for now with regards to the introduction. So let's dive in. Let me show you something that I've been working on. Today we're going to be working on an actual app that I built specifically for this purpose. It's a demo application. It's kind of like GitHub, but limited, obviously. It uses the GitHub API, the GraphQL API, so it will actually be fetching data, and it also has some components with some internal state. This is a React app, but in general, the ideas regarding Storybook are applicable to any UI library that works with the component primitive. So Angular, Vue, whatever, will all work. They all deal with this notion of a component that you reuse in multiple places, that you can compose into each other. All the modern UI libraries are the same in that regard. So this is actually, let me show you. This is actually an app that it was scaffolded with Create React App, and uses Tailwind for some styling. So I didn't bother to do all the various styling, and it has a fairly typical layout with pages and components and some static assets, and that's basically it. That's there is to use. We use React Router for some routing, and let me go to this thing over here. So it's basically a navigator for repositories on GitHub. You can actually change the URL to be any repository, but I listed a couple of example projects. So this is what Storybook would look like on GitHub itself, showing the code with the files on the right hand side, some issues and pull requests, and of course the README, which is the thing that you would want to check out. So, and also the URL for the Storybook project. So going there, you can find more information about Storybook if you would like to learn more. By the way, there's also learnstorybook.com, which is a great resource if you want to dive into getting started with Storybook by following an introduction, which is a lot of what we'll actually be covering today as well. But you can like follow along with this tutorial on the Learn Storybook website. All right, so the agenda for today is, first I'm gonna show you how to set up Storybook itself, and then we're gonna be writing some stories for our base components, and finally we'll tackle the more complex scenarios with the more complicated components, and in the end we'll have we'll look at a visual testing with Chromatic. All right, so let's actually, I'll switch to my master branch real quick. And this is just a vanilla React app, which doesn't have anything so far. So if you say, all right. So setting up Storybook in here is actually fairly simple. So far we have the general app. I can actually run yarn start. Let's hope it doesn't break on me, which spins up the app. Well, I already had it open right here, but actually let's close these. And there we have it. So this is the app that I built so far, and we'll want to add Storybook for that. Actually, let's put up the Storybook website and just go to the documentation real quick. There's a quick start guide on how to get started with Storybook. It's basically a copy paste command that you can do this. Copy this command, paste it in terminal. So let me open a new one and initialize a clean Storybook. So I obviously already did this in the other branch, but let's have it run real quick anyway. Storybook then has some configuration, but typically you don't necessarily have to touch it. Although for this app example, I did have to touch it. So I'll also show you how to configure like Storybook for your use cases. In this case, that meant dealing with styling for Tailwind and some decorators that I had to add for the React router to work, because otherwise my pages would blow up. All right, let's see where it's at. So far it's just running, and this thing will scaffold, like it will install all the dependencies and also scaffold some example stories for you that you can then see in the browser. It's unfortunate that it obviously takes a little while to install the stuff, but typically it should finish within a couple minutes. I think it's almost done. Save the log file, and there it is. Apparently has to do another run. Right, so run your Storybook with Yarn Storybook. I'm using Yarn. You can use npm just fine. It would be npm run Storybook. It's essentially the same trick. So let's see where we're at. I think so you see it's updated my package.json and my Yarn log file, and it also added a Storybook directory and some scaffolded stories. Now let's look at those real quick. We have the Storybook directory with some configuration. The main.js file is the configuration that you use to tell it where to find the stories based on a glob pattern like this. So in this case, it will look for my stories in my source directory and all the files that end with .stories.js. which is the typical setup that everyone uses. And then it's also installed some add-ons. You see add-on actions, add-on links, and the presets for create React app, because it's detected that I've used create React app. And then the stories are two default stories. I get some linting errors because it doesn't apply to my prettier configuration, but let's boot them up real quick. So you're in Storybook. This will automatically spin up the browser tab for me. So just we have to wait a little for that to show up. There it is. And you see welcome to Storybook. So this is now confirmation that it's worked. And it's also scaffolded an example for a button. But this button is actually just hard coded. It's not my button in my app, but it's just a button that comes from the demo React setup for Storybook. So let's switch over now to my other branch. So git reset hard, get rid of all, git stash min go away. All right, so git minus, and now I'm in a branch where I've already set up Storybook and some configuration. So let's see what's there. We have the app. Actually, let me reboot the script. Yarn start. I've actually extended my start command to also start Storybook. I am using runp for that. Let me show the package JSON for that. So I have a start which says runp star.star. So it actually starts all of these. So create React app with React scripts, some post CSS, which I'm using for the tailwind styling, and Storybook itself. So it's just one command. I have the full thing running. So here's my Storybook. And you see I already wrote a couple of stories, but let's actually, for now, remove this one, because that's the one we're going to be writing. So you see the app itself. It's over here. Let's look at the layout here. So we have a header for StoryHub itself, then a page header with some navigation with the tabs, and the title of the repository name, and finally some we have a couple buttons here that you can use to actually switch branches. So I can click arg stable, and you will see that it reloads the data for that. Actually, it should also have refreshed the README, but I don't know why that didn't work right now. So that's that part. Let's write a story for our button component. So we have this button component over here, and it's got your typical stuff going on. So it supports an appearance prop, and it can either not have this property or be primary or secondary, and that basically just changes the color of the button in this case. The specific way that I did the styling here, it doesn't matter. It's just a demo application, but this is how you would do it in Tailwind. So writing a story is as simple as like creating a file for it, button.stories.js. So it has to end with this .stories.js suffix, and the way that we write the stories is with a format called CSF, and it stands for that's actually good, component story format. So what we have to do here is first we have to import React, because we're going to write some React code, which is specific to the fact that we use React. And the way that CSF works is that it's very close to what plain vanilla JavaScript is. So all that I have to do is say export default and some object, and this object needs a title. And this is going to be the title of my story as it appears in the browser in Storybook. So I'm going to prefix it with components, which is like to add some folder structure there. Components slash and say button. So you can have your hierarchy of components in Storybook differ from the hierarchy that you would have on the file system. You can also install some plugins to have that automatically generated based on your component, your file structure on disk. And that's actually what we would prefer that you do. But right now, this is what most people actually do is write it themselves. And this just gives it the title. And the second thing to do is actually, thanks, my design of GitHub is nicer than the actual GitHub. I tend to agree, although mine is not nearly as polished and finalized as the actual GitHub. What you would do is export, variables. So you have the default export, which is the configuration of the story, and then you write the stories themselves. And in this case, you can label this variable anything. So I actually like to call it default for the one, like the index one. This is not the same as export default. This thing has it's capitalized in this case. So this is just a label as like any other. And what you write here is a story function. So all the stories are actually functions that are going to be invoked at runtime when you render them. So they're functions that essentially return the rendered component. So actually, before we continue here, I want to import the button from button.js and then render this button and button label. So now we have a story for this plain vanilla button, and let's see what it looks like in the browser. So let's go to over here, and you see there's now a button over here, a button component listed as a story with the default one at the top and the button label right here. You might notice that it's a little weird that it appears like not as nice, that it appears like flush to the top left corner of the canvas here. So that's actually going to change in Storybook version 6, where we introduced a new layout parameter for your stories, which by default is set to padded, which basically adds a 16 pixel or 1 rem margin around the canvas or inside the canvas around your components, so that it looks a little nicer in these situations. It's not flush, because otherwise things like a box shadow would not appear, like you would not see it in the top left side. You can also set this layout property to full screen, in which case you would see this behavior. So in version 6, this is actually a breaking change that will have padded canvas by default. So let's write the second one, export cons for my primary button. And that would be also a button with appearance of primary. And now you see there's a second one here, and that's my nice and teal looking button. So if you, by the way, are a bit annoyed by this padding and you would want to fix it in the current iteration, there is a way to basically wrap all of your your components inside some additional structure. So, and that you do that with decorators. You can actually have multiple decorators. They will be chained on top of each other. In this case, let's have only one. And a decorator takes a story function and returns the wrapped story. So let's say I have a div with class name equals padding 4, which is the thing from Tailwind, but it basically adds 1 rem of padding around it. And then in there we say story function. We invoke the story function, just like that. So essentially, I've wrapped my story in a div with some padding on it, and you see it right here. That's now like neatly spaced onto the canvas, and it applies to both of these stories. But you also see it doesn't apply. Actually, I did the same in the card one. It doesn't apply to all of the components, right? If you wouldn't have it here, it would again be flush. So these are only for the ones in this file. If you want to do something like this on a global level, you can actually export function default. Yes, you could probably do export function default. I don't know why you would want to do that, but yeah, you can. I'm just using the function, the arrow functions. I prefer that syntax, but if you prefer the classic function, so let's actually try that out. I'll say export function secondary. We have that one left, and that would return a button with appearance equals secondary label. You see that works just as well. Yeah, so if you prefer functions over arrows, then do your thing. That's a nice thing about the fact that it's just vanilla JavaScript. You can basically do anything right there. All right, so let's leave it at that. Let's actually restore this one. I was going to say you can also add decorators on a global level. Let me show you quick what that looks like. So we have the main configuration here, and then there's a configuration for preview. Preview is essentially the canvas where you would write your story. There's configuration for the preview, and then there's configuration for manager, which is Storybook itself. You can also like change the styling of your Storybook, for example, the Storybook UI itself, if you want. There would be manager.js for that. So this is what that looks like. In this case, I'm importing the generated styles from Tailwind, so that my stories also have access to these class names. And you see right here that I've used add decorator to apply a global decorator to all of my stories. And in this case, I needed to do that so that it supports React Router, because otherwise React Router is going to be complaining when I use the link component that comes with React Router. It will say like, oh, I see you're using this link component, but there is no router detected, so I can't actually render that. So that's why I had to wrap it in the browser router. But of course, I could like also add some div around this with some padding. But I don't want to do that because I also want to have screens in my Storybook, which will be full screen. So let's look at that. So you can use Storybook for just simple components such as a button, and then have more complicated components and stories which for the entire page header, for example, which looks like this. But what I actually want to do is have full pages in my Storybook. That's way powerful when you have all your pages, like the full layout of your pages in Storybook itself. So Storybook is way more than just a tool for building like simple components, but it's actually great if you also use it for pages or screens, whatever you want to call them. So this is actually what I've built so far. Actually, I didn't show you the other links. So there's issues here, which basically just link to GitHub, and pull requests, and it lists the latest pull requests and issues on the repo. So what I actually want to do is have a story for my issues page and my components and my pull request page. So actually, I already built one for issues. Let's build one for pull requests. So I'm gonna say create a new file. Say pull requests.js stories.js, and that would import React from React. That gets tiresome sometimes. Import pull from pull requests. Come on. Export default, the name of this thing. So title being pages/pull requests. And I'll have export the const default, or can call it anything you like. And that renders my pull requests page. So let's look at that in Storybook. So it will break probably. Oh, no, it doesn't work simply. That's because there's various things going on in pull request itself. So let's look at pull requests. It's a page, and pages they deal in data, right? So the problem here is that I want my stories to be stable, like regardless of whatever an API might return. I want my stories to always render in the exact same way. Otherwise, there's no telling if your story breaks because of the API, some API change, or that your story data, the story itself, is wrong. So you see, it uses things like use params, which is from React Router, use query, which is it invokes the GraphQL API of GitHub to fetch some data, and in this case, it just returns. It doesn't have any data, so it returns just an empty page, and the empty page does have the site header by default. So actually, what the problem here is that this component is not pure. By pure, I mean not having any side effects, not calling out to any API, simply only relying on the props that it's given, and then rendering with that. So what we're actually gonna do is take out the view part of this component, so just this one, and we're gonna say export const pull request screen. And that's a new component which simply returns, return this page that we had. And then over here, I'm gonna say pull request screen, like that. So obviously this thing is now gonna break because it needs some data. So it needs these pull requests. Let's in fact also pull out this thing and put that over here, because that's just taking the data and adding a created add date. So that's fine to have in the screen itself, because it will be stable across the data, but it needs the data. So let's have it take the data as a prop, and then we pass in the data over here. And let's see if this now is working. No, it doesn't, because I have to update the story. So the story I'm going to write is not going to be for the pull request with all the logic that surrounds it, but only for the screen, which is a pure component, right? Like that. So now it's going to break because it doesn't have a repository, because data.repository doesn't exist because I didn't give it any data. So actually what we have to do is pass the data over here. So what should that data be? So I'm just going to say const data is something. What I'm actually going to do is go into my app, this thing, open up my network tab, right? Refresh it once. So I'll see it fetching some data over here. And this looks like it's the data that we want. So I'm going to copy this, paste it right over here, save it so that it automatically reformats, remove this wrap. And I think that's that, and pass in this data over here. So now I have stable data. Like this is the actual stuff that would get returned. So this is actually pretty realistic. And we pass that data into my component. So looking at the story again, now you'll see I have a story with 3 pull requests that I was actually expecting, but where is my header? So looking at that, the pull request screen actually it renders a page, and this page component renders only renders the page header if it has an owner and a name, which is the Storybook.js/Storybook part. And those come from use params, and use params is something for React Router. But we don't have like routing in Storybook that we can access, right? Storybook controls the routing itself. So what we also have to do is pull out this stuff, because and then this will be params.owner, params.name, and I can remove this import over here, don't need it. But in my page thing over here, when I use this thing now, I'll have to pass the params in there. So actually use params over there. Would probably be nicer to create a variable for that, but let's go with it for now. By the way, this is not the right place, because this should actually be over here. So let's say params. Let's use params. This I'm going to say params, and then pass the params over there. This is the impure one. That's where I can use params, but not up here, right? So this should also be passed params. All right, let's see where we're at. Okay, can't read property owner of undefined. Params is not defined. That's because the story now also has to set the params, right? So params equals, and just say owner is foo and name equals bar, and we'll fly with it. And it doesn't work. Let me see why it doesn't work. Params is that part, params is that part, params is there, page, params owner. How you you basically start refactoring your components into something that doesn't deal with that. So this kind of gets annoying real quick, but that's it teaches you to work with these things in a pure way. By the way, if you have like a legacy app where you don't want to do all this refactoring, you can obviously use decorators and such to actually wrap all of your stories or certain stories in something like React Router with some actual like mock stuff on a global level, so that you can still work with your components, your stories, without having to refactor all the components to be pure. It's just saying that it's better to sorry, it's better to refactor your components to actually be pure, but it's not necessarily a realistic thing to do. So that's what we actually do as not realistic. So there's ways around that. All right, let's go with this for now, and show you something real quick. So these data things, right? Let's say we have this page header story here. Sometimes you want to use the same data, because well, I don't have this as an example, but like this one, for example, if I would write a story for this one, it would be using things like the page header and the page content, but the page header itself, like the story for that, has this data prop as some mock data for this story. It's actually best practice if you reuse this mock data across stories, right? So if I would have a story for page.stories.js, and I'm going to write a story for my page, it's better to simply import the mock data from my page header to pass along to the page header, rather than rewriting that stuff in the other story. So the way that you obviously do that is just export this const data and import it in the other story, like import data from some other story. So in this case, it's page header.stories that I want to import it from, right? So actually export default something, title, page. Let's actually not write the whole thing. But you kind of export const default equals this thing, which is the page, and it takes this data from the other thing, right? And of course I need to import page from page, and I need to import React from React. But now let's look at what happened in Storybook. This is something you would probably run into when you start trying to do something like this, is that my, actually refresh it, my page header component, let me check. I don't know what happened here. Page header story, did I not save it? Oh yeah, there it is. So this page header, I'm exporting data and route from this. And by default, you would see that data and route now appear as being a story, because the way CSF works, is that anything that you export, like any named exports, automatically become stories in Storybook. But obviously that will break because it's not a story function, it's actually just a bunch of data. So the way to deal with this is that you would want to exclude these two from being treated as stories. And there's a prop for that. It's called exclude stories. And it can take you can like have it be an array with all the individual names of the things. But in this case, I'm just going to use a regular expression to say anything that starts with a lowercase letter is not a story. So that's actually a very nice best practice, and this might actually become the default down the road sometime, that your story names should be with capital, so like in camel case like that, or Pascal case. So like something like that, default yada yada. And your data are lowercase, start with a lowercase letter. And then you can just use this very simple setting to have it be excluded. In fact, you could probably make this, I'm not sure, but you could probably make this a global configuration. I've not tested that actually. So that now they no longer appear as being a story. So that's the way around that. All right, so as the final part, I want to show something that I think is real cool, and that's the workflow that you get when you're using Chromatic. So let's go to chromatic.com and start using visual regression testing, which is what a Chromatic offers alongside this workflow. So I already set this up, but let's actually create a new project. By the way, you can have it linked to a GitHub repository or Bitbucket, GitLab. But in this case, I'm going to go with one that I just host locally. Like it's not on GitHub. I've not pushed it anywhere. So say Storybook, book demo app. That's going to be confusing with the other one, but sure, let's apply. And you'll get into this onboarding thing where it says like, oh, you should actually install Chromatic. That's something I've already done. And finally run this command right here. So that's what we're going to do. And actually, let's hope that it doesn't break. Chromatic not found. So yeah, I should probably add it. In my package.json, I think I do have Chromatic, but it's not in my dependency. It's added now. You'll see that it gives you a project token, which you could treat as a secret, but then again, it doesn't really give you access to anything. Well, not much, like only the status of a build and the number of changes, but not really anything regarding source code of your app. But still, this is your app secret in Chromatic. So installing stuff from npm is slow. You know why it's slow? Because it's CPU bound, and I'm running all this software to run a web seminar. So running Chromatic. Let's see where it goes. I think it's like running at 100% CPU usage with all the 8 cores that I have in this machine, I think. All right, building your storybook. So what Chromatic does is it will take your storybook that you have on your local file system, run a build for it, so it exports it to a static storybook build, which is something you could already do and then upload, for example, to Netlify or something. So it takes this static build and then uploads it to Chromatic. For one, that will give you free storybook hosting. That's also like under authentication. So you would have to log in with your GitHub account, for example. So you get Storybook hosting, and if it, by the way, so if it's an open source project, the Storybook itself is also open source, like open on without authentication. So you get free Storybook hosting with that, and finally run some stuff. So it's uploading my build Storybook, uploading to Chromatic, and then it starts snapshotting some stuff, verifying the build. By the way, I've been working on a completely new command line interface for Chromatic. It's way, way, way better than this thing. I spent 3 weeks full time like revamping that thing. So that's going to be released real soon. And by the way, even the views for the CLI are in Chromatic. I'll actually show you that in a moment. So you see the build is coming through now, but I have some errors in my page default thing and the other one. So that's a little annoying. That's something that would, by the way, should also show up in here. Yeah, see, it's broken. And then there's the other one with the issues default, which is also right now broken. I should fix those, but instead I'm just gonna throw them out. So that was actually my page and my issues, stories that I quickly wrote, and issues, this one. You can also, by the way, exclude them from Chromatic by adding some property on that. So it says like, okay, let's run it again, which is exactly what I'm gonna do, which unfortunately is going to be slow again. But let me show you something that I've been working on recently. So Storybook is awesome for web development, but you can use it for way much more. Storybook supports like all the various view layers, and it even supports React Native. So if you're building a React Native project, you can use Storybook with that. It will be a slightly different workflow where you'd have 2 separate apps running, like Storybook on one hand and your native app on the other side, right? But you can also use it for other stuff. So I've used it to actually create a command line interface to create stories for that. So there's Chromatic CLI now. And let's look at the library for, this is the default stuff, but I'm gonna, this is already new UI. So that is the new thing. There are some test stories here, but here's the UI for the CLI, right? So I have components in my CLI, the user interface of the CLI, and the messages, all the error messages are in here, so we can actually like look at those. So our designer and UX engineer, you can actually go over these stories here and say, oh, you should change the wording, the phrasing of this error message so that it's clearer, or like add a link to the documentation there. And that's amazing because it's really hard in a CLI to trigger those various edge cases, right? You'd have to deal with all those things some way. So now we actually have all of those stories in Storybook, and by extension in Chromatic. This is, by the way, what it looks like in Chromatic. So, and even to the point where I have the whole workflow in a story as well. So like authenticating with the spinner, that doesn't really work, but all the various steps that you get there. All right. Anyway, so you can use it for way more stuff than just web stuff, right? So nice. I published a storybook for my app, and you see there it detected the various components: the button, the card, the page header, and the pull request page. Let's catch a UI change. So what it now asking me to do is to make a visual change to one of my components, and let's actually take the page header, because you'll see I have the page header component here, and I have it also in my pull request page. So let's take the page header and change the background of this. I don't really like this gray, this tinted shade of gray. Or actually, let's change it to some light teal. Teal 200. I don't know if that's going to be nice, but let's look at. Oh, damn it. I kind of broke my stuff, but the page header here. So now it's teal. You like teal? I like blue. Blue 200. I like blue. So let's save this file. And now I'm going to run another build against Chromatic. And what Chromatic is going to do is going to it takes snapshots, like screenshots of your various stories as they appear in Storybook. That's what you see right here with these components. These are like images, right? And they are a screenshot that we've taken. And what Chromatic does is with every new build that you run on Chromatic, and that typically is something that you do in continuous integration. So with every push that you do, you run all these screenshots, and it will like compare pixel by pixel what's changed between one snapshot and the next, and then ask you to verify that this change was actually a change that I wanted to make or not. So it should be running the thing right now. So I'd have to build and upload it again. And typically, by the way, this is like seconds, but my PC or my laptop just does not like having to do all this work at the same time. OBS and my webcam software is like really heavy to do, because this is actually a 4K digital camera that we're recording this on. So that's where Chromatic is at. And actually, let's take a quick look at chromatic.com for that. So chromatic.com is this project that we are actually working on, and it builds on top of Storybook to publish your Storybook for free on visual tests, and also review stuff with your team. So we also, besides like taking these snapshots and having you approve or decline the change, we also do that for pull requests. So if you have a pull request on GitHub and it made visual changes, what we do is automatically take snapshots for this pull request and compare that to the base branch of the pull request. And then you will get a visual overview of everything that's changed for this particular pull request. And you can have your team, so like your designer, your product manager, have them review the changes before you merge the pull request. So this is like, it's like code review. It's like code review, but visually, right? So if you look at this, this is just the snapshotting stuff explained right here. So it takes the old one, a new one, and will show you the visual changes. So, and finally, you can integrate this stuff with Circle CI or with GitHub Actions or whatever you use, and then run this in with your pull request. Do I have an overview of that? By the way, these are actual components. If you look at this, these are components from the BBC and Formidable and Artsy, which are actual customers of ours. Like the BBC, they have their whole UI in Storybook in Chromatic. So you can actually like click on this one. You'll see the library for the BBC, which is pretty awesome. Anyway, so in terms of time, you'll see now it's finished with my change, and it's detected that there's two components which have now changed. So I can actually click one, I'm gonna pick this one, and you'll see the visual diff. It's highlighted in green. So this entire area was changed because I changed the background color. And I can say accept and continue, or like do something else. But this is the onboarding stuff. And this is how it would work. Is you can then have other people like ask them for feedback and have them comment. So we provide this entire commenting user interface with your team that you can comment on snapshots in Chromatic itself. And then once it's all approved, have it published and accepted, and your pull request merged. So you'll see that the stories appear now in my in Chromatic, and one I've already accepted, and reviewing them looks like this. So you get the side-by-side view of the old version versus the new version. You can also do like a one-up where you just switch between between the old and the new one. But I prefer the two-up, where you can also see something that we look at to detect changes than the gray. And I get a library with the stuff that I made, right? My pull request screen, and you'll see your story right here. And if I want, I can add a comment. That's amazing, but the data is off, right? So their data right here is missing. So comment there, and I've just started a discussion. And what this already also will do, if you do that on a pull request, it will lock the pull request, a check on GitHub, saying, hey, there's outstanding comments that you need to resolve before you can actually merge this pull request. So for the final couple of minutes, let's look at the questions that have been asked on YouTube. So if you have any more, keep them coming. So yes, this thing is a recording, will be available on YouTube later, or actually indefinitely probably. And so you start with the library and then create. What's the recommended way of moving your component from a Storybook environment to an actual application project? Right, so there is actually kind of two ways that people tend to work with components in Storybook. The one is actually pretty popular these days, is having a separate component library or design system, which might be a separate repository where all the components live alongside their stories, and then publish that, for example, in NPM for reuse by various teams. That's very nice if you have a bigger organization with lots of reuse and multiple teams working on this stuff and multiple applications where these components are used. So the BBC, for example, they obviously have a whole suite of various apps and websites where they want to have a consistent visual style, but there's various teams and various repositories where these projects actually live. So they have one central repository for the components, and then they use it from there. The other way is basically what I've showed you, just is you can have your components inside the app itself, leave them there, just write the story files side by side with them, and basically build it like that. And you can always extract, like take them out later, move them into a separate repository. I suggest like starting out with stuff in your app and not pulling them out at all, because that adds a whole lot of complexity. Only when you actually start needing to use it over multiple repositories, like multiple projects, then would be a good time to consider pulling it out into a separate component library. So how to use Chromatic for automated testing. So yeah, I've not showed that part, but what you typically do with Chromatic is that you link it to your continuous integration system. So actually, let me show you what it looks like for our own project. So this is BBC. Well, actually, let's go to Chromatic. So obviously, we have Chromatic in Chromatic. So we have that all on GitHub. And when we have a pull request, those will also they will appear up here. You didn't see that one with the other project because it was unlinked, but this one is linked to GitHub, so you get this pull requests tab over here. And then I can say, see, someone said add ID to interactive URL, and there were a bunch of visual changes. 12 UI changes were detected for this pull request by Norbert, and I can see that right here. So this is actually some test story apparently that was affected. So that might not be the best example. So typically we have pretty, so there's some errors here, let's fly with it. One of these. Yeah, actually this is a pretty interesting example. So you'll see that there is others chiming in to approve this. So Dominic is our designer, and he's gonna look at these stories, these snapshots, and saying, hey, there's something. He changed apparently this to be more consistent with the login screen success state, right? So I can actually click that and see them side by side. GitHub app installed, and apparently it was a different check mark that he changed for consistency apparently. So he prefers that one, fine. And you'll see that stuff side by side. So I can actually go over all these changes. Some stories have been removed apparently, right? This is no longer relevant. Perhaps it was renamed. Right, there are some new stories over here. So he basically revamped this stuff, renamed some stories. That's what you get. Apparently that's in something that might be a technical thing. This also sometimes is used for, in our case, for pretty big releases. So let me look at some changes here. That's unfortunate, it's no longer on the list, but sometimes we have, we're gonna publish a new release and we have a pull request for all the various things. So it's basically our next branch merging into master, that pull request. That is huge. Sometimes we have over like last time we had 800 changes or something on one pull request, which is an aggregate over multiple things. But it's very nice that you can see like what's actually the thing that we're gonna be releasing with this new release, right? And that might look something like this. Anyway. Coming back to the stories, there's someone asking, is it possible to host Chromatic on premise? No, it's not. We run this in the cloud. And actually, I want to show you this. There's a good reason why. So we have this build over here. You can also see per build, right? So that's a build for our entire repository. And builds are basically taking snapshots of all your stories. And we have, like you see, 1,400 stories in our story, because some have multiple viewports, so we have quite a few snapshots to take. And what we do is we parallelize all this stuff in the cloud. So if you have 1,400 stories, we spin up 1,400 web workers or work like lambdas in the cloud and do it all in parallel. And what that happens is that the build time for this thing is under a minute. So we actually ran 1,400 tests in less than a minute. If you use Cypress for something like this, that would be 30 minutes or more. So that's why one of the reasons why we do it in the cloud, we can parallelize. If I would try to run this thing on my MacBook, that would take hours. It's like really heavy stuff. So that's why we parallelize all that stuff. So I don't ever run like the full suite on my local machine. Maybe not hours, but at least 30 minutes or more. So no on-prem, unfortunately. We do support like GitHub Enterprise and SAML login on our enterprise plan and stuff, but you can figure that out. Have the option like the version Storybook add-on to explore builds version by version. Yes, we kind of do. What we do support is we have the Storybook for each branch. So we host your Storybook and we host that. We keep it hosted. So here I can view the Storybook for this particular build. So I can actually see an older Storybook hosted somewhere. But you can also link to it via the branch name. Let me look where there, I don't know it by heart, but I think it's up down here somewhere. Sorry, I would have to look that up. But there's, in our documentation, we say how you would, oh, it's not there. No. Chromatic.com/docs, that's the thing. Anyway, so we're already over time, so you can check it out in the docs. There's some link that you can like link to a Storybook by the branch name. So that would be a static URL over time. So it can point to the master branch, for example. Any other questions? because I'm actually about to wrap up here. It's been an hour. I had a blast. It's sometimes hard to explain this stuff, but I hope I did a decent job at it. So anyway, if you have more questions, actually, let's feel free to reach out to me on twitter.com. My account is actually G Hengeveld, so this one right here. Follow me on Twitter, and you can ask me questions there. My PMs are open, so feel free to reach out over there after the session. Follow me, of course, and please subscribe. Apparently, that's the thing. So this was my very first webinar ever. So I learned a lot also, and I hope you guys enjoy. So, and you're welcome. So I'm out. See you later.